This is more about Charles Darwin and evolution. Charles Darwin is best known for his theory of evolution, natural selection, mutation, adaptation, survival of the fittest, and, I suppose, the Scopes monkey trial. A great font of ferocious journalism and, ultimately, Inherit the Wind. His theory, as I understand it, states that if we consider a one-celled organism, toss in a few million years, we will wind up with not just the human race, but all of the animal and insect life on Earth. The same holds true for plant life. This theory is elegant, dramatic, and fueled by a fantastic biological propulsion. My problem, if it is one, is that even with the fossil record, I have never completely bought into it. I can see evidence that points to it, but I've never seen scientific documentation that absolutely establishes it in its fullness beyond question. Well, I don't understand quantum mechanics either. When the young Darwin was sailing around the world, the seeds of his theory were already in the air. Early on in his book about the voyage, he refers to Lamarck when he sees evidence of a possible change in a creature from the norm of its species, as in the blindness he finds in a subterranean rodent. Is this an accident, he wonders, or part of a permanent alteration in the creature? Darwin was intent on fashioning a great idea out of all the otherwise scattershot observations he made during the voyage. Galapagos was the petri dish that gave birth to that idea. There were 10 islands, 5 larger, 5 smaller. Nothing could be less inviting than this first appearance, he wrote. Closer inspection opened his eyes. The natural history of these islands is eminently curious, he wrote, and well deserves attention. Most of the organic productions are aboriginal creations found nowhere else. There is even a difference between the inhabitants of the different islands. The archipelago is a little world to itself, rather than a satellite attached to America. He lists all the bird life he finds, concluding with this: the remaining land birds form a singular group of finches, related to each other in the structure of their beaks, short tails, form of body, and plumage. There are 13 species. Oh, those finches! Oh, those beaks! He wrote, seeing this gradation and diversity of structure in one small, intimately related group of birds, one might really fancy that from an original paucity of birds on this archipelago, one species has been taken and modified for different ends. He's on it now. I have not yet noticed by far the most remarkable feature in the natural history of this archipelago, he writes. It is that the different islands, to a considerable extent, are inhabited by a different set of beings. Several of the islands possess their own species of the tortoise, mocking thrush, finches, and numerous plants. This, he writes, strikes him with wonder. From this will come evolution. I would say that it would not be surprising to me that if isolated gene pools of a species were completely removed from one another, after some time minor variations would begin to appear, and that is not evolution, unless, given millions of years, it is. Darwin knew that the facts of science can flatten a good story. Earlier, concerning island habitation, he wrote, I fear it destroys the poetry of this story, that feather and dirt feeding and parasitic insects and spiders should be the first inhabitants of newly formed oceanic land. And he wrote, causes generally quite inappreciable by us determine whether a given species shall be abundant or scanty in number. More philosophically, he wrote, the limit of man's knowledge in any subject possesses a high interest, which is perhaps increased by its close neighborhood to the realms of the imagination. So, with respect to his great idea, is evolution solid scientific fact or imaginative fancy? At the very end of his book, Darwin wrote a caution to himself. Travelers often move quickly, he wrote, and make sketches instead of detailed observation. Here arises, as I have found to my cost, he writes, a constant tendency to fill up the wide gaps of knowledge by inaccurate and superficial hypotheses. It was a warning, but he was too enthralled by the sweeping power of his great idea to pay it any heed. Maybe he was right. Many brilliant, studious people think so. I'm not sure.